march was called the Bataan Death March. Approximately, estimates vary, but approximately 11,000 men lost their lives on that march alone. Those that survived, well, their nightmare of captivity had really just begun. They were then herded into cattle cars, so tightly that many suffocated on their feet. And they were transported to camps where they were subjected to unspeakable cruelty, disease, and sickness. After that was over, and as the Allied troops began to close in on the Japanese, they were herded into hell ships, unmarked ships that were targets for American Allied submarines as they were headed to Korea and Japan. Very few survived that, but my dad was one of them. And as we grow up, as I grew up with him, he never talked about being a soldier. He never talked about his experience as a POW. And I think as kids, we all have expectations of our parents, of what we expect from them, what we want from them. And I was no exception to that. There were times when I think I wanted more from my dad than he was able to give me, or perhaps could. It wasn't until I was in my 40s that he came to me one day and he handed me a book. The book was called Some Survive. It was an account, a detailed account of the Bataan Death March, and of the experiences of the POWs during the Bataan Death March and until their liberation at the end of the war. And I have to say that in reading that book, it became glaringly apparent to me for the first time what a remarkable man. He was. That it wasn't about that he couldn't give us more after all that he had been through. It was that he gave us so much, given all that he had been through. But you see, the important thing here is that for me to understand my dad, I needed to understand a little bit more about his story. Story number 2. The year is 1967. I'm going to talk to you about me for just a second. I had enlisted in the Army, and after some training, I was sent straight to Vietnam. I was stationed at a place called Da Nang. It's in northern I Corps, northern part of southern part of Vietnam. A little place called Marble Mountain. Scott mentioned that. It was a helicopter gunship platoon. Our job was to support other helicopters that were either inserting or extracting troops that were on the ground. We supported medevac helicopters that would come in and try and get our troops out that had been injured so they would get them to more advanced medical facilities in a safer place. And really just to help anybody out that had gotten themselves into trouble. The way we would do that is we would come in and we would try and create as much havoc as we could on the ground so that the enemy would have to concentrate on us so that our guys could get their job done and get out. I was a teenager, fresh out of high school. Dawns on me, just for a little perspective here. That's not an awful lot older than a lot of you guys are right now. And once I got into Vietnam, it became glaringly apparent to me that I had better get real good at my job if I ever had any hope of coming home in one piece. I had better get as good at my job as I could get. That I needed to embrace the concept of teamwork, and that I needed to watch my buddies back and hope that they watched mine, because when things went south, and oftentimes they did, you needed all the help you could get. I think you sometimes find yourself in situations, I know that I did, and Vietnam was like this to me, Situations that are bigger than yourself, larger than you are, more important than you are. That's what Vietnam was to me. It was about freedom. It was about my country. It was about my family. It was about honor. And I think when you find yourself in situations that are bigger than you, you reach farther. You last longer. You sometimes do things that perhaps you wouldn't do in a normal situation. So, when it was my turn to come home, I'd spent 2 years over there, almost 2 years, not quite, but pretty close. We were back to back, and we called home the world in those days. When it was my turn to come home to the world, I was just as excited as the next guy. I didn't know what to expect, but I didn't get what I expected. When I landed at the airport in San Francisco, we all had to wear our military uniforms in those days. I think you still do. You get the military to pay for your flight, so everybody knew that I was in the military, and everybody knew where I had come from. I was a little confused. Didn't know quite what to do with the group of people that met me there, and some other military folks that were with me, and began to jeer at us, call us names, accuse us of things that they apparently thought that we had done. We got it. And security was called, and they got us out of there, and all of us were sent home to the various places that we lived. When I got home, I have to say that more instances like that occurred. My solution to it, as dysfunctional, admittedly, as it was, I'm not proud of this, but I withdrew. And I began to drink. Drank a lot. I'm not going to bore you with those stories because I'm sure you can connect the dots. But it took me a long time to work myself out of that mental mess that I was in. But you know what? Had you seen me back in those days, in the 10 to 15 years after I returned from Vietnam, there's no telling what kind of an impression I would have made on you. I'm pretty sure it wouldn't have been a good one. But had you known a little bit more about me, if you'd known a little bit more about my story, perhaps, just perhaps, you would have had a little bit more compassion for that lost soul that stood before you way back then. The third story I'm going to tell you about is a buddy of mine. He's a good friend. He's a Navy SEAL. Excuse me. He's a great big guy. Intimidating guy. He's one of those guys that, y'all probably know somebody like this that you take one look at and you know that this isn't the guy you need to be messing with. But he really isn't like that. If you got to meet him and visit with him for a little bit, I'll bet you would come away with the impression that he is what a compassionate and generous and gentle person he is. And your impression would be spot on. But let me tell you about his last mission as a SEAL. He was on a gunboat. There was an ambush, and there was an explosion. My friend and his best friend were blown into the water. He was in the water, imagine this, in the water, holding on to his best friend who was mortally wounded, trying to keep him above the surface, as he watched his ship slowly sink under the water. Now imagine that. There you are, alone, with your best friend who has just died. And you see your vessel begin to submerge, and the last sight you have of it is of the American flag on the standard on the transom of that boat as it sinks slowly beneath the surface of the waters. Let me tell you, an indelible impression was made on my friend at that moment. Many years have passed now. And My friend has moved on. You know, he's a firefighter. He's an artist. He's a compassionate friend to many. He's really a neat guy. And you would never know anything other about him but those things that I just mentioned, except for every once in a while, under certain circumstances, a different friend comes out. Imagine with me for a moment what he would do if he happened to witness someone burning or otherwise desecrating the American flag. First Amendment right, you say? Okay. But let me tell you something. My friend holds that flag. Not just as a piece of cloth that contains red, white, and blue and some stars and stripes. But that flag represents an awful lot more to him than just that. And you know, you might see him expressing his displeasure to somebody that was burning the flag or otherwise, as I said, desecrating it. And you might just say, if you didn't know any better, just another conservative whack job. But you know what? Now that you know a little bit more about his story, you might have a little bit more compassion. Even though you might disagree with his methods, you might have a little bit more compassion for him. You know, I say all of this because there are so many stories. So many stories that have come home recently. So many stories that have come home in the past. And you know what? So many stories that are going to be coming home in the future. These stories all have faces attached to them. They're the faces of our moms and our dads. They're the faces of our brothers and our sisters, our family and our friends. These people that sacrificed greatly and given much, only to come home many times to a world that has also changed greatly. I say all this because, in my view, these men and women deserve, at the very, very least, a thank you and a welcome home. And I think that you have no idea what it means when someone says something as simple as, thank you for your service. Welcome home. Thank you all for the courtesy.